The gym was packed that Monday morning, and Blake, a 30-year-old with black hair, green eyes, and a muscular build, was adjusting weights at the station. Known around there as a focused but friendly guy, he rarely got distracted by who was coming or going. But that morning, a new face caught his eye immediately. A tall, robust man with a gray beard and red hair that highlighted his impressive presence had walked in. Blake tried not to stare, but he couldn't help sneaking glances at him. The man seemed to notice Blake's looks, returning them with a subtle smile as he moved closer to the station next to him. When Blake found himself beside him, he seized the opportunity to strike up a conversation. "You must be new here," he commented casually, trying to sound relaxed. The man smiled, his deep voice inviting. "Yeah, just started this week. I'm Grayson," he replied, with an amused sparkle in his eyes. The vibe was friendly, but the glances they exchanged carried an energy beyond words. From that first meeting, Blake and Grayson started seeing each other almost daily at the gym, always by coincidence, or maybe not. Both stayed focused during workouts, but exchanged glances and discreet smiles between sets. It was as if each other's presence was the extra boost they needed. Every time Blake looked over at Grayson, he noticed new details. The confident way he handled the weights, how his gray beard contrasted with his intense expression, and the way he always seemed aware of Blake's presence. One day, Blake was in the locker room adjusting his shoes when Grayson walked in, wearing that usual calm and confident smile. His presence there, in that quieter, more private space, made the atmosphere even more intense. Grayson nodded in greeting. "You're training hard today, huh?" he said, hanging his towel beside him. Blake chuckled, trying to disguise the nerves that Grayson's presence always stirred in him. "Gotta stay in shape, right? But you don't seem to be taking it easy either." Grayson shrugged, his eyes sparkling with that mix of charm and mystery that made him so irresistible. "When you've got the right company, it's easier to stay motivated." They both laughed, but the air between them grew denser, almost palpable. Grayson took a step closer, his gaze locked on Blake's as if the world around them had vanished. Blake's heart raced, unable to resist the attraction building between them. The connection between Blake and Grayson became more obvious with every encounter. Glances during sets, exchanged smiles in the hallways, and quick conversations in the locker room created an almost magnetic energy between the two. Gradually, what started as curiosity and attraction seemed to be evolving into something more, as if both were waiting for the right moment to cross an invisible line between them. One afternoon, after an intense workout, Blake was in the locker room catching his breath when Grayson walked in. Their eyes met, and Grayson's familiar smile now held something more, a silent invitation Blake couldn't ignore. Grayson approached, the air growing more charged with each step. "Do you always train like this? So focused, but with that mystery?" Grayson teased. Blake laughed, but the closeness left him visibly nervous, though he tried to hide it. "Mystery? I think that's more your style than mine," he replied, his eyes locked on Grayson's, as if no one else existed in that locker room. Grayson took one more step, their faces close enough for Blake to feel his breath. "Maybe we have that in common then," Grayson murmured, his voice low as if it were a secret between the two of them. The moment was charged, and before he could think, Blake felt Grayson's hand on his shoulder, firm but gentle, amplifying the tension between them. Blake responded to the touch, unable to resist. They stared at each other, And in that instant, the line between casual and inevitable dissolved. From that afternoon on, Blake and Grayson seemed to have an unspoken understanding. Their gym encounters had taken on a new meaning, with each workout becoming an excuse to be close, share discreet smiles, and steal moments that became essential. When they were side by side at the machines, it was as if the entire gym buzzed with electricity. Both knew they were experiencing something unique, and the adrenaline of the gym only intensified the connection they felt. One day, after a particularly tough workout, Blake noticed Grayson scanning the room, checking that they were alone. With a sly smile, he gestured toward the locker room, and Blake followed without a second thought, heart pounding with excitement. The silent, empty space seemed the perfect place for them to finally break the tension between them. In the locker room, with no one around, Grayson leaned against a locker, giving Blake a look that left little to the imagination. Without a word, Blake stepped closer, the proximity amplifying the intensity between them. When they finally stood face to face, Grayson held his face gently, and they lost themselves in the moment as if they were suspended in a bubble outside the world. From that day on, the locker room became their secret space, where they could be themselves without a care in the world. Blake and Grayson's relationship had become the most exciting secret of their routines. Every trip to the gym was another opportunity to be together, and although they tried to keep everything discreet, the shared smiles and quick glances betrayed the connection between them. It had turned into a sort of game. Both knowing the secret only intensified everything. Still, that locker room became their refuge, the place where they could express their feelings freely, away from curious eyes. Over time, their meetings in the locker room became a ritual. They trained hard, teased each other between sets, and always ended up in that secluded spot where the adrenaline of their workout exploded into moments of pure intensity. Grayson, with his steady demeanor and gray beard Blake found irresistible, would joke that they were making the place more interesting. Blake couldn't help but laugh, knowing that it was this mix of humor and romance that made it all worthwhile. Their secret relationship had become a source of excitement for both, and with every meeting, the trust between them deepened. Yet in between laughs and whispered conversations, they both knew they couldn't keep it hidden forever. But for now, they preferred not to think about it. Blake and Grayson had become masters of secrecy. Their trips to the gym had turned into a meticulously orchestrated routine. They'd arrive at different times, avoid lingering eye contact during their workouts, and kept their conversations lighthearted and casual whenever others were around. But the locker room became their sanctuary, the one place where they could truly be themselves and let their connection unfold without restraint. Once inside, the carefully guarded facade would crumble away, leaving only the two of them and the electricity between them. That Friday, after an especially intense workout, Grayson watched Blake discreetly as he finished his push-ups. There was something almost mesmerizing about the way Blake moved, the focus he poured into every exercise. Grayson, usually a practical, reserved man, found himself feeling drawn to Blake in ways he hadn't expected. It was more than attraction. It was an almost magnetic pull he couldn't resist. Once the last few clients had left the gym, Blake and Grayson exchanged a knowing look, both fully aware that this was the moment they'd been waiting for all day. They headed into the locker room, where the silence around them only seemed to amplify the chemistry simmering between them. Grayson approached Blake with that subtle smile, the one that said so much without a single word. "You really went all out today," he murmured, taking in the sheen of sweat on Blake's skin. "I wanted to make sure I could keep up with you," Blake replied, his eyes flashing with a mix of humor and desire. This time, their moment together stretched out, both of them savoring every second as though the space itself held its breath. Grayson gently cupped Blake's face, their eyes locking in a way that spoke volumes. The connection they shared pulsed between them, a force too strong to deny. They knew the risk, knew they were towing the line, but the thrill, the attraction, made it all worth it. Here, in this private corner of the gym, it felt like the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of them in a moment of shared intensity that couldn't be denied. The intensity between Blake and Grayson grew more undeniable with each passing day. What started as quick glances and lingering touches in the gym had blossomed into something neither could ignore. Their connection was electric, a secret that made every meeting feel like a forbidden adventure. But secrecy was a delicate game, and each time they met, it felt as if they were pushing the boundaries a little further. They'd learned to stay alert, to keep their exchanges subtle, but even the most careful plans could unravel under scrutiny. On this particular day, the gym was packed, with every machine in use and a steady stream of chatter filling the air. Blake and Grayson worked through their routines separately, catching each other's eye across the room, each stolen glance feeding an excitement they couldn't deny. Their unspoken connection seemed to heighten, growing more intense every time their gazes met. They had turned the gym into their own secret playground, and every whispered word, every shared look felt like a promise of what was to come. Blake finished his final set and headed toward the locker room, knowing Grayson would follow soon after. They'd perfected the timing by now, slipping into the back room just when they could be certain no one would notice. But that day, there was a slight change, a subtle tension in the air that neither could ignore. Blake couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching more closely than before, that maybe their secret had slipped beyond their control. Still, when Grayson joined him in the locker room, all his doubts faded. Being near Grayson was like stepping into a private world, one where nothing else mattered but the two of them. As they stood in the quiet of the locker room, Grayson reached out, his hand finding Blake's in a gesture so simple, yet charged with meaning. Blake felt a rush of warmth as their fingers intertwined, and for a moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the world. "This place has become my favorite part of the day," Grayson murmured, his voice low and filled with a softness that took Blake by surprise. "It's our secret, our space," Blake replied, unable to keep the smile from his face. But as they stood there, a shadow of worry crept in. What would happen if they couldn't keep this secret much longer? Their time together was always fleeting. Each encounter a mixture of exhilaration and suspense. As Blake pulled away, he glanced at Grayson with a look that said more than words ever could. They both knew that the risk they were taking was growing, that people were noticing. But for Blake, every second was worth it. This connection was worth it. With a nod, Grayson smiled, signaling their silent agreement. They'd hold on to their secret as long as they could, savoring every stolen moment. As they left the locker room separately, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt heavier, the eyes of the gym staff lingering a little too long. He knew they were dancing on the edge, and for the first time, he wondered how long they'd be able to keep their world hidden. The following week brought an unusual tension that Blake couldn't ignore. He and Grayson continued their secret encounters, drawn to the excitement and thrill that their hidden connection provided. The locker room had become their refuge, the place where they could drop all pretenses and let the reality of their bond flourish. But the more they tried to keep things discreet, the more it felt like they were being watched, as if the walls themselves were closing in on their secret. That Friday, Blake entered the gym with a feeling he couldn't shake. Grayson was already there, working through his sets with the same confidence that had first drawn Blake in. Their gazes met, and for a moment, everything else faded. The unspoken pull between them was too strong to ignore. They shared a brief smile, each silently counting down the minutes until they could slip away to the locker room. When the moment finally arrived, they moved quickly, each step an echo of the countless times they'd done this before. The locker room was quiet, a secluded oasis from the bustling gym outside. As Blake closed the door, he felt a surge of anticipation. This was their space, their time. Grayson was already waiting for him, leaning casually against the lockers, his familiar, confident smile playing on his lips. "You know, I didn't think I'd be looking forward to the gym every day," Grayson murmured, his voice low as he closed the distance between them. Blake grinned, the warmth of Grayson's presence washing over him. "Then I guess I'm doing something right," he replied, the tension between them mounting with every word. But as they moved closer, the sound of a faint click echoed through the room. Blake froze, his heart pounding as he looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. It was then that he noticed a small red light blinking in the corner of the ceiling, a camera he'd never seen before. Panic surged through him, and he grabbed Grayson's arm, gesturing toward the light. Grayson's face went from surprise to dread in an instant as he realized what it meant. They've been watching," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. The weight of the situation crashed down on him. They'd been so careful, or so they'd thought. The thrill and the secrecy, it had all been for nothing. Just as they were processing this, the locker room door swung open and the gym manager stood there, his expression a mix of discomfort and authority. "Gentlemen, we've had some incidents reported, and I'm afraid the footage confirms it," he began, his voice strained. "We can't allow this to continue here." The reality of his words hit them like a punch. The place that had once been their refuge was now a spotlight, exposing them in a way they'd never expected. Grayson exchanged a glance with Blake, a mixture of frustration and regret clouding his face. Yet, even in that tense moment, Blake couldn't help but feel a sense of loyalty to the man beside him. They had shared something real, something that went beyond the walls of this gym. With a quiet sigh, Grayson looked at the manager, nodding in silent agreement before turning back to Blake. "Looks like our secret's out," he murmured, a hint of humor still in his voice despite the situation. They gathered their things and left the locker room, the silence between them heavy yet filled with an unspoken understanding. As they walked through the gym for the last time, side by side, Blake felt a bittersweet ache. The gym had been their starting point, the place where their connection had first sparked. But as they stepped out into the cool night air, he realized that they didn't need a place to make their connection real. They had each other, and that was enough. Grayson looked over, his usual smirk replaced by a genuine smile. "Guess we'll have to find a new meeting spot," he said, his tone light but filled with warmth. Blake laughed, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. No longer bound by the secrecy of the gym, they were free to explore what lay ahead. Whatever challenges came next, he knew they'd face them together. Have you ever had a secret, intense experience like this? Or wondered what it would be like? Share your story in the comments. Let us know if you've had a similar moment or if you're still looking for an unforgettable experience.